Hi, I'm Simon Michael, and I'm back to read the second chapter of The Brief, the first in the series of Charles Holman thrillers. In the first chapter, we met Charlie and saw the train wreck of his private life and met some of the actors who were about to turn his life into sheer living hell. In this chapter, you're going to be introduced to the two well-dressed celebrity gangsters who ran London for most of the 1960s, the Kray twins. Bow Street Magistrates Court is a beautiful Victorian building almost directly opposite the Royal Opera House and a stone's throw from Covent Garden. But it's shabby and it smells. The corners of the entrance hall are littered with rubbish and cigarette ends, and it stinks of stale cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies. It's been raining hard since dawn, and the lobby is packed with defendants, witnesses, lawyers, policemen and reporters sheltering from the rain. And as Charles enters the lobby, he's suddenly struck by a smell reminiscent of a damp sheep pen, wet wool. Charles elbows his way to the door leading down to the cells, presses the bell only once, as the grubby notice tacked to the door requires, and waits. There's a long pause. In the distance, from the other side of the door, he hears the jangling of heavy keys. The wicket in the door slides open, and a face appears. Yes? Do you have a couple of prisoners named... And Charles pauses and scans his notebook for his potential clients. Plummer and Sands. The officer checks a list of names on a clipboard in his hand. Yeah, they arrived a few minutes ago. And you are? Counsel. The wicket closes and Charles hears fumbling with keys. The door swings inwards. Come in, sir, says the officer. He closes the door behind Charles and leads him to another, constructed of heavy steel vertical bars. I'm afraid both interview rooms are occupied, so you'll have to speak to them in the cells. That's okay. I shan't be long. Down on the left, points the officer. Last door. Charles leads the way down the narrow corridor. As he passes the penultimate cell, he looks through the open wicket. Sitting on the wooden bench, facing the door, is a good-looking, well-built man of around 30, wearing prison uniform and the cropped haircut of a convicted prisoner. As Charles goes past, the man leaps to his feet. "Charlie!" he shouts. "Charlie Horowitz!" Charles stops in his tracks and backs up a couple of paces. "Reggie? What are you doing here?" Reginald Kray had been convicted 9 months earlier of involvement in what the papers called a Chicago-style protection racket. It was ironic. He and his twin ran the most violent and successful protection racket in London. But on this particular occasion, Reggie was almost certainly innocent, a fact which hadn't prevented his conviction. He is now halfway through an 18-month sentence. Reggie Kray approaches the door and leans towards the wicket to speak confidentially. Charles can only see the bottom half of his face. "Applying for bail, pending appeal," he says in a low, fast voice. "Look, Charlie, do us a favour, would you? It looks as though they're taking me out first, but my brief's not arrived. Can you do the application? It's all settled. Old Bill ain't objecting." Charles has known the Kray twins for almost 20 years. He was a teenager when he first laid eyes on the two identical boys, all knobbly knees and grubby defiance, when they were first brought to the Rupert Browning Institute. That's the boxing gym at Elephant and Castle, where Charles and his brother David had been training and fighting in junior championships, by then for a couple of years. The twins matured into good boxers. Reggie could have had a professional career had he wanted, and for a while he and Charles shared the same trainer, an ex-pro named Charlie Sims. Charles hasn't seen either of the twins in person for over a decade. The break with his family was the last straw, and Charlie closed the door on his former life in the East End. He has no wish for that door to be reopened. He leans into the wicket to reply. I'm sorry, Reggie, but I've got my own clients here today, and I'm not allowed to take over the case when you've already got a barrister instructed. But, oh, fucking hell, Charlie! But, I'm happy to see what's happened to him. Maybe get the case put back till he arrives. Reggie pauses, swallows, and nods. Thanks. But it ain't a him, it's a her. Really? Says Charles, surprised. There are only a handful of women at the bar, and very few indeed who practice in crime. Look, Ronnie's upstairs somewhere. He's got her details. Go and have a word, would you? For old time's sake? I'd really appreciate it. Charles doesn't want Reginald Cray's appreciation. Like many in the East End, the Crays have a strong sense of obligation. If you do them a disservice, or take a liberty, as Ronnie prefers to express it, they won't rest until they've exacted revenge. On the other hand, if you do them a favour, they will feel equally obligated to repay it. Favours from the Cray twins are the last thing Charles needs. He's had enough trouble already facing down the daily snobbery and prejudice evinced by most of his colleagues without creating the impression that he's friends with major league criminals. So he hesitates. On the other hand, he tells himself, what harm can be done by having a word with the court clerk about the listing? Every barrister does it, jockeying to get their cases on first or last, depending on whether they're in a hurry or need more time with their clients. Okay, no promises, but I'll see what I can do after I've spoken to my clients. You're a diamond, Charlie. No promises, Reggie, repeats Charles. The officer, waiting patiently by Charles's side, continues down the corridor and opens the next cell door. Counsel to see you, he says to the occupants. One, a short, stocky man with short hair and a long pink scar slanting from his eye to the corner of his nose, looks up from the bench opposite the door. The second paces back and forth nervously. He looks taller than the first and might once have been powerful, but what muscle he possesses has turned to slack, grey flab. I'm afraid I'll have to lock you in, sir, says the officer. You know where the bell is if you need me. Yes, replies Charles, and the door clangs shut behind him and the key turns in the lock. Charles draws a deep breath to introduce himself and immediately wishes he hadn't. He peers into the lavatory bowl set into the floor next to the bench. It's full. You've asked them twice to flush it, says the seated man in a strong Glaswegian accent, seeing Charles's expression. They're too busy. Inmates are provided with no method of emptying the bowl for fear they may hang themselves with the lavatory chain. It's evident that this bowl has not been emptied for some time. Charles presses the button on the wall and shouts through the door, Jailer! There's a pause and a voice calls, Are you finished, sir? No, but would you please flush this toilet? There's no reply, but a few seconds later the toilet flushes. Thank you, calls Charles. He turns to the two men. Okay, my name's Charles Holborn of Council. Mr. Ralph Cohen was at the police station last night and was lined up to hold your hands while you were being interviewed. We ain't been interviewed yet, says the taller man in a deep Cockney rumble. And yet you've already been charged, and here you are, comments Charles. Doesn't that strike you as unusual? No, not if they've already made up the interviews, says the Scotsman simply. The officer's a bloke called D.I. Wheatley, explains the other. He's a verbals specialist. Charles nods. The willingness of Detective Inspector Wheatley of the Metropolitan Police to fabricate false confessions, verbals, has made him notorious within the criminal fraternity. A cunning and arrogant policeman, with an upright bearing and a military manner, he's marked out for promotion due to his sparkling clear-up rate, courtesy of his preparedness to make up shortcomings in the evidence by concocting or planting evidence. His suspects have a tendency to suffer accidental falls down the cell steps before they reach the safety of the magistrate's court. One actually died while assisting police with their inquiries. "I know Wheatley well," says Charles. "We've crossed swords before. Look, it's entirely up to you. Shall I sign you up, or do you want to take your chances with the duty solicitor?" "You've got to be joking," says the smaller man scornfully. "Have you met him?" "Yes, I have. Mr. Baker's a very pleasant gentleman. He was just down here." "The man's a fucking idiot," says the Scotsman. "I'd rather do it myself." The Cockney intervenes. "Who did you say sent you?" "Ralph Cohen? Cohen and Partners?" The man turns to his companion, who is still not moved from his place on the bench. "I know him. He's a clever little Jewish geezer, and he's represented me on a couple of times before. My dad used him on a long-firm fraud years back. Got him off too. I'd be happy with him." "So," says Charles, "you are presently unrepresented?" "That's right," says the taller man, now extending his hand. "I'm Derek Plummer," he says, "and that's Robbie Sands." Charles shakes the hand of the tall Cockney and offers his to the Scotsman. Sands remains where he is, staring at him dispassionately. Charles smiles good-naturedly. "Mr. Sands, I'm perfectly happy to represent Mr. Plummer alone. As you say, you could do it yourself, although I wouldn't recommend it on charges of robbery and murder." "How do I know you're any better than that duty solicitor?" he asks. Charles smiles again. "You don't. But I've been a barrister for a decade, and I've dealt with serious cases at the Old Bailey and other criminal courts." "Murder?" "No, not murder. But we're not talking about the trial. It's a capital charge, so you're entitled to a silk." "I'll wait for a silk then." "You'll be pushed to find one at Bow Street Magistrates' Court on a wet Thursday morning," says Charles. "It's a bit down market for Queen's Counsel." Plummer turns to the Scotsman. "I think we should go with him. We can always change our minds later." "Is there any conflict between the two of you," asks Charles, "which might prevent me acting for you both?" "I see. And the police haven't caught the third man?" The others shake their heads. "Well, look, if your stories are the same, there's no reason why the same barrister can't represent you. In fact, it's tactically better that way. But as I say, today's not the trial, so shall I leave it to you, or would either of you like to be represented?" Charles brandishes the legal aid forms he needs completed. "It's no skin off my nose," says Sands nonchalantly. "Sure, I swear to sign." "Just a few questions first," says Charles, opening the document. "Is there room for me to sit down for a moment?" Sands swings his legs down and Charles sits. "Okay. You first, Mr. Sands. From the top. Name of applicant." That's part 1 of chapter 2. Part 2 will follow shortly. Thanks for listening.